Two arrogant cops thought they were above the law when they arrested a Latina woman, until they discovered she was the chief judge, and by then, forgiveness was far too late. The morning air in the city carried the faint hum of traffic mixed with the distant sound of sirens, the kind of background noise Judge Isabella Morales had long grown used to. Despite holding one of the most powerful positions in the state's judiciary system, her mornings remained deliberately simple. No chauffeurs, no security detail, no grand luxury cars pulling up to escort her, just a quiet breakfast of coffee and fruit, a walk with her old Labrador, and the drive herself to the courthouse in her reliable black sedan. To the outside world, Isabella was a force of law and intellect, a Latina trailblazer who had risen from a working-class immigrant household to become the chief judge of the state Supreme Court. In court, her reputation was legendary. Her rulings were sharp, unflinching, and respected across the political spectrum. She had struck down corruption at the highest levels and defended the powerless with a fierceness that earned her the nickname, the Iron Gavel. But on this particular morning, her humility and independence, choosing to drive herself wearing no official robe, just jeans and a fitted blazer, would make her appear like any other citizen. And that illusion was about to be exploited. She had barely driven 5 blocks from her suburban neighborhood when flashing red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. Isabella frowned, easing her car to the curb. She wasn't speeding, didn't run a light. There was no reasonable suspicion for this stop. Still, she rolled her window down as the officer approached. "License and registration," demanded Officer Daniels, his tone clipped, almost hostile. He didn't greet her, didn't explain the stop, just barked the order like she was already guilty of something. Isabella, calm and composed, reached into her purse, retrieved her license, and handed it over. "Good morning, officer. May I ask what this is about?" "You fit the description of a suspect," Daniels muttered, barely glancing at her ID. He handed it off to his partner, Officer Clark, who leaned casually against the hood of their cruiser, smirking as if this was entertainment. "Description?" Isabella repeated, her brows tightening. "That's vague. Could you be more specific?" Clark chuckled under his breath. Daniel's lip curled. "Don't get smart. Step out of the vehicle." "On what grounds?" Isabella pressed, her voice firm but still professional. She knew her rights, but more importantly, she knew the law. Every word they spoke was being carefully stored in her mind, catalogued for later. "You're resisting an officer's orders," Clark said, his smirk widening. Resisting? The accusation was absurd, almost laughable. Isabella Morales had spent her career hearing real cases of resistance, of violent confrontations, of actual crimes. To hear these officers casually toss the phrase at her for simply asking a question infuriated her. But anger would not serve her now. She took a slow breath and unbuckled her seatbelt. "I am stepping out under protest," she said clearly, ensuring bystanders could hear her. Her voice carried authority even in casual clothing, but the moment her foot touched the pavement, Daniels grabbed her arm roughly, spun her around, and yanked her wrists behind her back. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed louder than the traffic passing by. A crowd had already begun to form, neighbors peeking out of windows, pedestrians slowing to watch. Whispers rippled through the group. "Wait, isn't that Judge Morales? What the hell are they doing?" They can't be serious, but Daniels and Clark were too blinded by arrogance to care. To them, she was just another Latina woman, alone, easy to bully into submission. "You're making a serious mistake," Isabella warned, her voice cold and steady despite the humiliation of being pressed against her own car. "The only mistake is thinking you're above the law," Daniels spat back, the irony of his words almost laughable. Her sunglasses slipped slightly down her nose as they shoved her into the back of the cruiser. From that angle, she could still see her license tossed carelessly on the hood of her car, shining under the morning sun. It was a symbol of everything wrong with this moment. They didn't care who she was, what she represented, or even what her ID clearly said. They saw only what they wanted, a woman they could dominate, intimidate, control. Inside the cruiser, the steel cage of the back seat felt suffocating. But Isabella didn't panic. Years in the courtroom had trained her to keep composure under pressure. She had stared down mob bosses, corrupt CEOs, even crooked politicians with more power than entire police precincts. Compared to that, 2 arrogant cops were nothing more than an inconvenience. An injustice she would soon dismantle piece by piece. Yet as the cruiser pulled away from the curb, she couldn't ignore the sting of humiliation. She had spent her life proving that Latinas belonged in the highest halls of justice, She had shattered ceilings that had stood for centuries. And now, here she was, reduced to just another woman in handcuffs by men too reckless to realize the consequences of their actions. The ride to the precinct was quiet, except for Clark's occasional snicker from the front seat. Daniels adjusted the mirror to glare at her. Bet you don't feel so important now, huh? Isabella met his gaze without flinching. Power built on arrogance crumbles faster than you think. Daniels shifted uncomfortably but said nothing more. When they arrived, the station smelled of stale coffee and sweat. Officers turned their heads as she was paraded through the squad room, whispers following her like a shadow. Some recognized her instantly, others blinked in disbelief. Wait, is that? No way, that's the chief judge. What the hell did Daniels do? Still no one intervened. The code of silence in precincts ran deep. She was shoved into a holding cell, the clang of the metal bars closing around her. Her wrists ached from the cuffs, her dignity bruised from the spectacle. But her spirit, unbroken. She sat down on the cold bench, straightened her back, and folded her hands in her lap. If they thought this cell would break her, they were mistaken. She wasn't just a detainee, she was a witness now. A witness to every misstep, every violation, every ounce of corruption on display. By the time the sun set, the news of her arrest would ripple through the city like wildfire. Judges would hear, attorneys would hear, the media would feast on the scandal. And when the truth surfaced, Daniels and Clark would wish they had never pulled her over. For now, Isabella Morales sat in silence, her mind already strategizing, her heart steady, her gaze unwavering. She knew one truth that the officers hadn't yet realized. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of theirs, and it would not end well for them. The walls of the holding cell were painted a dull gray, chipped in places where time and neglect had eaten away at the surface. A faint buzzing light overhead flickered inconsistently, casting uneven shadows that danced across the room. The bench she sat on was cold steel, bolted to the floor, and her wrists carried the raw red marks of the handcuffs that had been ripped from her only minutes earlier. Chief Judge Isabella Morales sat in silence, back straight, eyes unblinking. Her very presence in that cell seemed to warp the air around her. She didn't pace nervously like the usual suspects brought in. She didn't shout, didn't beg, didn't break down. She simply sat, calculating, absorbing every detail. To her, this wasn't imprisonment. This was evidence. From outside the bars, the low murmur of the precinct buzzed with life. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and muffled conversations overlapped one another. But every so often, Isabella caught the stolen glances. An officer pretending to shuffle papers, another adjusting his holster, both stealing looks through the corner of their eyes at her. Whispers followed, "Is that Judge Morales? No, it can't be. Why would she be in here? Daniels brought her in." Said she resisted. Resisted? Are you kidding? She's the chief judge. The rumors were already spreading through the building like wildfire, and yet, no one stepped forward to open her cell. The blue wall of silence held strong, even when everyone in the room knew that Daniels and Clark had crossed a line so thick it might cost them their careers. The sound of boots scuffing the tile broke her thoughts. Officer Clark swaggered down the hallway, a smirk plastered across his face, one hand resting lazily on his belt. He stopped in front of her cell, gripping the bars with both hands. "Comfortable?" he asked, tilting his head like he was speaking to an animal at the zoo. Isabella lifted her gaze, piercing him with her calm brown eyes. "Every second of this will serve as testimony." Clark blinked, caught off guard by her composure. He recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Lady, you're in a cell. You don't get to testify. You're the criminal now." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "You've already made your first mistake. You think those bars put me below you. They don't. They've put you exactly where I can see you clearly, and where the entire world soon will too." Clark's smirk faltered. For a second he opened his mouth as if to snap back, but no words came. He turned abruptly and walked away, his confidence leaking out with every step. Hours crawled by. Isabella sat motionless, hands folded in her lap, while the world outside her cell shifted and churned. The station phones began ringing more frequently. One officer dropped his voice as he answered, "Yes. Sir, yes, it's true, Chief Judge Morales. No, I don't know the details yet." By late afternoon, the buzz of activity had shifted into something heavier. The precinct was tense, weighed down by the gravity of what had been done. The chief judge had been dragged in without charge, without cause, humiliated like a petty thief. The story had already left the station. It was on its way to the courthouse. It was on its way to the media. The cell door clanged open suddenly, startling even Isabella. Officer Daniels stepped inside, his jaw tight, his face red with anger. He leaned down close, his voice low and threatening. "You think your title saves you?" he hissed. "We're tired of judges like you. Always breathing down our necks. Always ruling against good cops just trying to do their jobs. You're a parasite, Morales. You think you got power, but out here we decide who walks free and who doesn't." For a moment, the silence between them was heavy enough to crush the air. Then Isabella leaned forward, her voice calm but cutting like a blade. "You just confessed more than you realize, officer, and you've already lost." Daniel's nostrils flared. He slammed the bars shut behind him and stormed out. Minutes later, the sound of heels clicking down the hallway replaced the chaos. Attorney Marlene Vega, Isabella's closest friend and one of the sharpest legal minds in the state, burst through the precinct doors like a storm. A petite woman with jet black hair tied in a bun, she carried the kind of presence that demanded attention. "Where is she?" Marlene barked at the desk sergeant. The sergeant fumbled his words. "Ma'am, you can't just—" "I am her counsel," Marlene snapped, flashing her credentials. "You have unlawfully detained the chief judge of this state without probable cause. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Her voice carried across the entire squad room. Every officer within earshot froze. Daniels and Clark exchanged nervous glances but stood stubbornly near the back. Marlene stormed down the hallway, heels striking the floor like gunshots, until she reached Isabella's cell. Her face softened instantly. "Izzy, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Isabella said smoothly, standing to her full height. "But they're not." The desk sergeant scrambled for the keys, hands shaking, and opened the cell. Isabella stepped out gracefully, brushing her blazer as though she had simply been sitting in a waiting room. But the faint red bands around her wrists told the truth. Truth the cameras outside would soon magnify. Daniels marched forward, voice rising. She resisted arrest. "That's on record." "On what record?" Marlene cut him off. Her eyes narrowed. "Produce the report. Produce the body cam footage. Produce the probable cause affidavit. Produce anything, because without it, you've got nothing. You've got a lawsuit, misconduct charges, and the end of your careers." The entire room fell silent. The sergeant looked pale. Clark swallowed hard, his smirk finally gone. Daniel's jaw clenched as he realized the weight of what he had done was beginning to crash down on him. The precinct captain finally emerged from his office, his face stern, sweat gathering at his temples. "Release her immediately," he ordered. His tone carried no room for argument. "She's already been released," Marlene snapped. "But this isn't over. You'll be hearing from us and the press." Isabella adjusted her sunglasses, sliding them back over her eyes as she walked toward the exit with Marlene at her side. The room was silent except for the clicking of her heels. Every officer watching as the woman they had tried to humiliate walked out stronger than she entered. The sun outside was beginning to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. A small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, reporters, activists who had heard whispers of what happened. As Isabella stepped into the light, cameras flashed, microphones extended, and voices shouted questions. "Judge Morales, is it true you were arrested? Do you plan to press charges? What happened in there?" She raised a hand, silencing the crowd with nothing but her presence. "The truth," she said firmly, "will come out. Abuse of power cannot hide in the shadows forever. Justice is not intimidated by handcuffs." And with that, she walked into the sea of cameras, her head held high. Behind her, in the precinct, Daniels and Clark finally began to feel the creeping dread of what they had unleashed. Their plan to humiliate her had backfired spectacularly, because Isabella Morales wasn't just any woman. She was the chief judge, and this was only the beginning. The morning after her release, the courthouse was a different world. The marbled halls that usually carried an air of formality now buzzed like a hornet's nest. Reporters crowded outside the steps, cameras flashing, their voices colliding in a storm of questions. Clerks whispered nervously in corners, their eyes darting to the entrance as if waiting for a ghost to appear. And then she did. Chief Judge Isabella Morales entered the building with her head high, her steps measured, her posture regal despite the bruising humiliation of the day before. She wore her robe this time, not just as a symbol of her authority but as armor. The same reporters who had captured her in handcuffs now clicked furiously as she strode past. An image that would flood television screens across the country by nightfall. The chief judge returning, unbroken. Inside the courtroom, silence fell as she took her seat on the bench. Lawyers and defendants alike turned to stare. Even the bailiffs stood straighter, sensing the electricity in the air. When the proceedings began, Isabella raised her gavel, but instead of calling the first case, she spoke directly to the room. Her voice was calm, commanding, each word carefully measured. "Yesterday I was unlawfully detained by 2 officers of this city," she began. The room collectively inhaled. "I was treated not as a citizen deserving of rights, but as a target for humiliation. Let the record show that this is not just my story. It is the story of countless others who are silenced because they lack the privilege of being seen. Abuse of power thrives in silence. But today silence ends." Her words rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. A murmur spread, followed by the clicking of pens as journalists scribbled furiously. By noon, her statement was on every news channel. Headlines screamed across the screen. "Chief Judge Morales speaks out after shocking arrest." "Did police target the state's top judge?" "Abuse of power exposed in humiliation of Latina judge." The city erupted. Community leaders called for investigations. Civil rights groups staged protests outside the precinct. Students, workers, families all marched with signs reading, "Justice for Morales" and "We stand with Izzy." But while Isabella returned to her bench with dignity, Daniels and Clark were drowning. At the precinct, the atmosphere was no longer one of swagger and smirks. It was suffocating. The phones never stopped ringing. Angry citizens demanding answers, city officials panicking over damage control. The captain barked orders, but no one could contain the chaos. Daniels sat at his desk, his jaw tight, while Clark chewed nervously on his thumb. "This is a witch hunt," Daniels muttered to anyone who would listen. "She's just making us look bad because we stood up to her." But even he didn't believe it anymore. The mirror in the locker room had reflected it back at him that morning, the fear in his own eyes. The swagger was gone. The headlines weren't going away. Internal Affairs had already opened an investigation. They demanded body cam footage, arrest records, and written reports. Clark's hands shook as he tried to fill out paperwork retroactively, his lies collapsing under the weight of details he couldn't explain. And then came the footage. The body cam had indeed captured the stop. Though Daniels had muted sections, the visuals told the story. Judge Morales calmly stepping out of her vehicle, her ID visible on the hood of the car, her questions polite, reasonable, firm. And then, Daniels spinning her, cuffing her, shoving her without a word of lawful explanation. When the footage leaked to the press, it was over. Every network replayed it on a loop. Analysts dissected it frame by frame. Citizens who had once doubted her now stared in shock at the evidence. And those who had always believed systemic abuse was real finally had undeniable proof. If they could do this to the chief judge, what chance did ordinary people have? In her chambers, Isabella watched the footage once quietly. Marlene stood beside her, arms crossed. "They're finished," Marlene said flatly. "Not yet," Isabella replied, her eyes narrowing. "They'll scramble, they'll plead, they'll try to paint themselves as victims. But the law will do what it always must, expose them." And indeed, Daniels and Clark tried. On a local talk show, Daniels insisted. She resisted. She thought she was untouchable. "We didn't even know who she was at the time." But the anchor cut him off. "Your body cam shows her identifying herself. It shows her license. It shows her calmly asking what the stop was for." Daniel's face flushed on live TV. His denial crumbled. Meanwhile, Clark issued a shaky statement outside the precinct. "We were just following procedure." It was a misunderstanding, the crowd jeered. Protesters shouted back, "Misunderstanding doesn't leave handcuff marks. Procedure doesn't mean humiliation." By the end of the week, both officers had been suspended pending trial. But for Isabella, the fallout wasn't just about her. It was about every single person who had sat in her courtroom claiming they'd been targeted unfairly. Every young man or woman whose voice cracked as they described a stop that went too far. She had always listened. She had always believed them. But now she had lived it. At a press conference, she addressed the crowd again. Cameras flashed. "This is not about me," she said, her voice firm. "This is about a system that allows unchecked power to humiliate and intimidate. We cannot stand idle. We cannot look away, because today it was me, but tomorrow it could be your son, your daughter, your neighbor, your friend. And for too long, that truth has been ignored." The applause was thunderous. Back at the precinct, Daniels and Clark sat in silence, the roar of protest chants echoing faintly through the glass windows. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" Daniels buried his face in his hands. Clark finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're screwed, man. Totally screwed." Daniels didn't respond. He already knew. The iron gavel had been struck, and it wasn't going to stop. This wasn't just fallout anymore. This was the beginning of the trial of their lives. The courtroom was overflowing with people. Word had spread quickly throughout the city that two officers had not only abused their authority, but had dared to arrest the chief judge of the state Supreme Court, humiliating her in public. For weeks, the media had run the story on every channel, highlighting the video recordings, eyewitness accounts, and the officers' blatant lies in their reports. By the time the trial began, this wasn't just a case of misconduct. It had become a referendum on power, justice, and corruption within law enforcement. Judge Elena Morales sat at the bench in her black robe, her posture calm but commanding. She wasn't the one presiding over the case. Ethics required she step aside, but her presence was unavoidable. As chief judge, she was both victim and symbol of the proceedings. Sitting in the audience, her sharp eyes followed every detail. The defense tried desperately to frame the incident as a misunderstanding. Their attorney, a smug man in a gray suit, stood before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "my clients believed they were conducting a routine stop. They didn't know who Judge Morales was at the time. Was there an error in judgment? Perhaps, but malicious intent? Absolutely not." His words were carefully chosen, but the problem was clear. The evidence told another story. The prosecution wasted no time dismantling the narrative. They began with the video recorded by a passerby. On the large screen, the jurors in the gallery watched the chilling footage. Judge Morales being thrown against her own car, her hands wrenched behind her back, one officer sneering, "People like you think you're above the law." The audience shifted uncomfortably. The disdain and arrogance in the officer's tone were undeniable. Then came the body cam footage. Though some of it had mysteriously gone missing, the remaining segments were damning. It captured the officers laughing as they tightened the cuffs, one saying, "Bet she'll learn not to mouth off next time." The prosecution paused the video. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor said, his voice steady, "does that sound like a routine stop? Or does that sound like officers abusing their authority to humiliate someone they thought was powerless?" The courtroom buzzed. The officers sat rigidly at the defense table, beads of sweat forming on their foreheads. When it came time for the officers to testify, the tension hit its peak. Officer Daniels, the one who had led the arrest, took the stand first. He avoided eye contact with Judge Morales, staring only at his hands. "I was just doing my job," he muttered. "She refused to comply with my orders. How was I supposed to know she was a judge?" The prosecutor leaned in. "You didn't need to know her title, officer. You needed to know the law. Did she resist arrest?" Daniels hesitated. She questioned me," she argued. "That's not resisting arrest," the prosecutor snapped. "That's exercising her rights as a citizen. Did she ever physically threaten you?" Daniels squirmed. "No, but she—" "No further questions." The prosecutor cut him off, letting the silence drive the point home. The second officer, Ramirez, fared no better. He tried to shift blame onto Daniels. "I was just following my partner's lead," he said nervously. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. "So you admit it went too far?" Ramirez froze. He had trapped himself. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "Accountability Now." Activists, civil rights leaders, and everyday citizens chanted together, their voices echoing through the streets. News anchors reported live, noting how the case had become a symbol of a larger problem: the unchecked power of some officers and the system that protected them. For Judge Morales, the public's outrage was bittersweet. She never sought to be the face of a movement, but she also knew that if she stayed silent, nothing would change. She had spent her life defending the Constitution. Now she found herself embodying its fragility and its resilience. The most explosive moment came when the prosecution called an unexpected witness, the internal affairs officer who had investigated the two cops in the past. "Is it true," the prosecutor asked, "that these officers had multiple complaints filed against them before this incident?" The defense objected, but the judge allowed it. The internal affairs officer nodded. "Yes, excessive force, unlawful detainment, verbal abuse. None of the complaints resulted in serious discipline. They were always brushed aside." Gasps filled the courtroom. The pattern was undeniable. These weren't good men who made one mistake. They were repeat offenders shielded by a broken system. As the trial neared its conclusion, the defense grew desperate. Their closing argument tried to appeal to fear. If every mistake by a police officer is treated as a crime, the defense lawyer warned, who will protect us? Who will patrol our neighborhoods? The prosecutor stood slowly, letting the silence build before responding. Who will protect us, he said firmly, from officers who think their badge is a license to terrorize the innocent? Who will patrol our neighborhoods if the very people sworn to serve abuse their power? Accountability does not weaken justice, it strengthens it. The jury sat stone-faced, absorbing every word. That evening, Judge Morales sat alone in her chambers, staring at the city lights. The trial wasn't just about her anymore, it was about the future of justice in the country. She thought of the countless faces she had seen in court over the years. Poor families, immigrants, young men broken by the system. She thought of the courage it took for them to speak out, often against impossible odds. And now here she was, forced into their shoes, living their reality. It humbled her. It fueled her. She whispered to herself, "This isn't about revenge. It's about truth." The jury was sent to deliberate, and the waiting was agonizing. Hours turned into a full day. Reporters speculated endlessly. Would the jury side with the officers, granting them the benefit of the doubt, or would they finally hold them accountable? When the foreman finally returned with the verdict slip, the courtroom held its breath. Judge Morales, though not presiding, sat in the front row, her heart pounding. The judge unfolded the slip and read aloud. On the charge of assault under color of authority, guilty. On the charge of unlawful imprisonment, guilty. On the charge of falsifying official reports, guilty. The room erupted. Some wept, some cheered, others simply sat in stunned silence. For once justice had prevailed, but for the officers it was too late. Their pleas for forgiveness, their excuses, their attempts to shift blame, it all collapsed under the weight of truth, and for Judge Elena Morales, the fight was only beginning. The case had exposed cracks far deeper than two rogue cops. It had revealed a system in need of transformation. The courtroom's energy lingered long after the verdict was read. Reporters scrambled to file their breaking stories. Activists embraced one another, and citizens stood in awe, murmuring that maybe, just maybe, things could finally change. But Judge Elena Morales sat quietly in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady. She had waited years to see justice delivered so clearly, so decisively, yet the victory felt incomplete. The guilty verdicts against the two officers were only a symptom. The disease, the culture of impunity, still ran deep within the veins of the system she had sworn to uphold. Sentencing day was no less charged than the trial. Both officers stood in shackles before the bench, their once proud uniforms replaced by prison jumpsuits. Their families sat behind them, whispering prayers and sobs. The defense begged for leniency, citing years of dedicated service and a single lapse in judgment. But the prosecutor reminded the court of the repeated complaints, the abuse of power, and the humiliation inflicted not just on Judge Morales, but on countless others who never got the chance to prove their innocence. The judge delivered the sentence with unflinching clarity. Officer Daniels and Officer Ramirez, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in state prison. You abused your badges, your oaths, and the trust of this community. The law is not a weapon for your egos, but a shield for the people. Today that shield is restored. Gasps and cheers erupted simultaneously. The officers' faces collapsed, disbelief painted across them. Their pleas for forgiveness had come too late. Later that afternoon, Judge Morales stepped onto the courthouse steps, surrounded by cameras, microphones, and a sea of supporters. The flash of bulbs lit her face, but her tone was measured, calm, deliberate. "This case was never about me," she began. Yes, I was handcuffed. Yes, I was humiliated. But I had the privilege of being recognized, of having my truth heard. Thousands of others, citizens who lacked power, status, or wealth, did not. Their stories were buried. Their complaints were ignored. Their dignity was trampled. Today's verdict is not the end. It is a beginning. The crowd erupted into applause, but she raised her hand, signaling for quiet. We must reform our system from the inside out. Accountability must be more than a word, it must be our practice. No one, not even those who wear the badge, should be above the law. If we do not learn from this, then justice has failed. Her words echoed across the city, replayed on every news station, debated on every talk show. To many, she became the face of a new movement, but not everyone celebrated. Police unions lashed out, accusing her of vilifying officers and weakening morale. Some politicians bristled, wary of reform that might upset their donors or allies. Anonymous threats began arriving at Judge Morales' chambers, scrawled on letters or left as voicemails. You think you're safe because you're a judge? Think again. Her security detail doubled overnight, but she refused to retreat. If I cower now, she told her clerks, what message does that send to those without protection? Her resolve only grew stronger. Within weeks, the governor announced the creation of a state commission on law enforcement accountability, chaired by none other than Judge Elena Morales. The commission's mission was sweeping: review past misconduct cases buried by bureaucracy, recommend reforms for use of force, policies establish independent oversight, boards in every county, ensure body cam footage could never, again, be lost without severe penalties, public. Hearings drew crowds like concerts. Citizens lined up to testify, sharing stories of wrongful stops, intimidation, and harassment. Some spoke trembling with fear, others with anger that had simmered for years. Judge Morales listened to every word, her pen scribbling notes, her expression grave but empathetic. Each testimony reinforced her belief. This wasn't about one case, but a pattern decades in the making. Meanwhile, the two disgraced officers entered prison life, stripped of their authority and their illusions of invincibility. Daniels, once arrogant and smug, now avoided eye contact with other inmates. Ramirez, who had followed his partner blindly, spent nights staring at the ceiling, replaying every decision. Word spread quickly among the prison population who they were. The badge that once shielded them became a target. Some inmates taunted them. Others threatened them. For the first time, they felt the raw vulnerability of those they had once controlled. Forgiveness was no longer in their hands. The system they had exploited had turned on them, and no amount of pleading could undo the damage. The case didn't just stay local, it went national. Major networks ran documentaries, podcasts dissected every moment, and law schools studied it as a turning point in constitutional law. Civil rights organizations praised Judge Morales for her courage. Some even suggested she should run for higher office, Senate, perhaps even governor. She declined each suggestion, reminding them, "My duty is here in the courts where justice breathes." Still, her influence spread beyond her courtroom. Other states began adopting similar commissions, citing her leadership as the catalyst. One evening, months after the sentencing, Judge Morales sat on her porch with her elderly mother, sipping tea under the fading sun. The world outside was still buzzing with debates, reforms, and protests. But here, in this quiet space, she allowed herself a rare pause. Her mother touched her hand gently. "Are you proud of what you've done?" she asked. Morales smiled faintly. "Proud isn't the word. I'm relieved. Relieved that truth still has power. Relieved that maybe the next generation won't have to fight the same battles we did." Her mother nodded. "Justice is not about punishing, it's about healing. You've given this country a chance to heal." Months later, as she walked into her courtroom to preside over a new case, she paused at the bench. The memory of her own humiliation, the cold steel of handcuffs, the laughter of the officers flashed through her mind. She looked out at the faces in the gallery, scared defendants, worried families, lawyers prepared for battle, and she made herself a promise. Every person who enters this room, she thought, will be treated with the dignity I was denied. Justice will not bow to arrogance or power. Not in my courtroom. Not ever again. The gavel struck, echoing through the chamber. It wasn't just the start of another case. It was the continuation of a legacy. because the cops had pleaded forgiveness when it was far too late. And from their downfall, a movement for true justice had risen.